All right, informative speech, take 18. It's Paul, Darren, Lynette, Pepsi, and Chief. Can you see?
Yeah.
All right, let's do this. October 1962 saw an unprecedented threat emerge, the threat of thermonuclear destruction by the United States and the Soviet Union. These were the key players. President John F. Kennedy, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader, and the President's brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States. This all began with a routine U-2 spy flight which took photos of missiles placed in the island of Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. JFK decided to keep the photos secret until him and his advisors could decide what to do with them. This group convened about what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets denied the existence of any offensive weapons. The nuclear weapons were brought by ship, and JFK decided on a naval blockade to mitigate that threat. Cooler heads prevailed as the leaders realized the threat of destruction. A series of public and private deals were struck to avert disaster. These 2 weeks were made into a book and a movie known as 13 Days. This situation was brought about by several key factors. The Soviet Union was vastly behind the United States in the development of nuclear weapons. Russian missiles could only reach Europe, while the United States could reach the whole USSR. Khrushchev conceived a bold plan of putting nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. He needed a nuclear deterrent against the United States, which had none. Fidel Castro was the leader of a fledgling government in Cuba, a fledgling communist government in Cuba. The U.S. sponsored a failed coup attempt in 1961, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was followed by a military exercise in 1962, codenamed Ortsac, not very creative, only Castro spelled backwards, which the U.S. military simulated the overthrow of the leader of a Caribbean nation. Fidel Castro had seen enough, and he accepted Khrushchev's offer of missiles and protection. The missiles were on the way. He believed a U.S. invasion was imminent. Weapons were transported via non-military vessel. This was done for fear of detection by the United States. Some 60 missiles were transported in all. The missile's discovery was spurred by the increased shipping activity to Cuba. There was a rumor that the Soviets were up to something in Washington, D.C. CIA Director John McCrone warned Kennedy about the suspicion of nuclear weapons. Initial spy pics found only surface-to-air missiles in Cuba, which were for air defense only. The Soviet ambassador assured Robert Kennedy that there were no nukes on the island. This caused JFK to order another U-2 flight on October 9th. This revealed the presence of Soviet SS-14 nuclear missiles, which could reach major population centers in the United States, as well as several places in Central and South America. Defense Secretary McNamara laid out 3 options: to challenge the Soviets diplomatically, a naval blockade, or a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. The United States' maintenance of secrecy was a major concern. JFK had to keep his daily routine. He kept meetings with his executive committee behind the scenes. The military leaders wanted to bomb Cuba off the map. They were embarrassed by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. JFK ordered another U-2 flight October 17th. This showed the presence of longer-range missiles that could reach most of America, except for the states of Washington and Oregon. JFK knew he had to decide blockade versus invasion. He instructed Ted Sorensen, his speechwriter, to write 2 speeches, one for each eventuality. JFK could no longer keep his daily routine. He had to return to Washington, D.C. under the guise of illness via the form of an upper respiratory infection. JFK chose blockade because this gave the Soviets a political and diplomatic option out of the crisis. They had to call the blockade a quarantine, however, because a blockade was technically an act of war. The American media was ready to run the story. President Kennedy called them personally to convince them not to, begrudgingly. He did not want his plan to be revealed until his speech to the American public. The apex of this came as JFK prepared to give his speech. He gave a copy of the speech to Khrushchev the morning before he delivered it. Khrushchev was no doubt infuriated. The 3 points of Kennedy's speech were to halt the offensive buildup in Cuba by the Russians, the increased surveillance and military buildup of the United States in the event of invasion, And the third was to consider any weapon launched from Cuba against the Western Hemisphere as an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union. The situation got worse when a U-2 spy plane was shot down. This was done by a rogue Soviet commander and not under the direction of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev knew that he had lost control of his military and it was time to cut a deal. When the situation looked most bleak, cooler heads prevailed. Through back-channel and official communications, John and Robert Kennedy were able to cut a deal. Soviets agreed to turn the ships around and dismantle the weapons that were already present in Cuba. The United States agreed to never invade Cuba and to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey. Through the patience of JFK and Nikita Khrushchev, the world was brought back from the brink. This ushered in a new era of compromise. Unfortunately, that ended with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas in November of 1963 and the removal of Nikita Khrushchev from office by a rogue faction of the Parliament of Russia known as the Kremlin. One only wonders what could have happened had these two men stayed in office. Thank you.
Sweet.